It's the Church of Jesus Christ.
If one wants to decide that the New Testament is historically untrustworthy, then one must be willing to become a complete historical agnostic.
We have more biblical manuscripts than any other of the ancient manuscripts.
What is remarkable that Christianity was able to get off the ground to begin with. Josephus reports that messianic figures were a dime a dozen in his day.
The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ changed the world. Yet some scholars try to minimize these events by claiming they were spiritual but not historical.
When I talk to Christians, I find that a lot of them have a non-biblical view of truth. They kind of think of Christianity as applying to the sacred area. Christianity is true in that realm, but is Christianity really true in the secular realm? Is it true about the world?
Indeed, is Christianity true in actual history? Consider these facts about Jesus and the 4 first-century Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Virtually all scholars agree, even the very skeptical ones, that the Gospels were written somewhere between 20 and 65 years after the life of Jesus. So relatively speaking, the Gospels are recent accounts of Jesus compared to his life.
Scholars note that there are many, many copies of the New Testament, far more than any other book of antiquity.
We have 6,000 biblical manuscripts, and many of them are very, very close to the original time they were written. We have manuscripts from the 2nd century, very close to the time of Jesus. This is very different from the other ancient writings like Plato. We don't have any writings of Plato until 1,300 years after he lived.
New Testament scholars have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the manuscripts, the material that we have to deal with. Scholars of classical literature, classical Greek, classical Latin texts, have a dearth of evidence.
But can we be sure that the copying of these manuscripts was accurate?
When it comes to the copying of the Gospels, what we have is a tradition of writing. And so somebody's writing something down, the next person is looking at it, and his intention is to get it exactly right. It is not to garble it. We have manuscripts from the 2nd century that tell us what was said. And we see how little the text has changed from the 2nd all the way through the 15th century.
Of course, the 15th century was when Gutenberg developed printing. Copies of all books written before that were manuscripts, as in things written by hand. Meanwhile, there are other early writings, Christian and non-Christian, that attest to Jesus.
Some people might not know that Jesus himself, as a historical figure, is referenced by several non-Christian sources. There are Jewish sources that refer to him.
Most of the witnesses that we have are Christian witnesses, but among the most important witnesses is Josephus, who is a 1st century Jewish historian who lived right after the time of Jesus.
He wrote the history of the Jews from earliest times to the present, and he has a paragraph about Jesus where he describes that he was a very virtuous man, he was very moral, and he had many followers. He was then put on trial by Pilate, crucified, and his disciples said that they saw him 3 days later. And Josephus says perhaps he was the Messiah that the prophets spoke about.
All the core elements of Jesus' life, not the details, but the core outline, are in what Josephus says.
We have literature written by secular or non-Christian historians around the time of Jesus. So shortly after Jesus, you have Tacitus, Josephus, Lucian, and Marabar Serapion.
In addition, we find that modern archaeology attests to the reliability of the Bible.
When I began my academic career, we could only talk about 20 or 25 biblical people, biblical names that had been verified through archaeological discovery. Well, now the number's like 85. The number just keeps growing. Keep in mind, we've only excavated 5 or 6% of the biblical world. Well, as we keep excavating, that's why these numbers keep getting bigger.
Furthermore, the biblical Gospels serve as reliable guides for archaeologists. That is not the case for later pseudo-Gospels, like those Dan Brown made famous in his bestseller, The Da Vinci Code.
Well, just imagine recruiting 100 people who spend $3,000 each to fly to Israel and stay in a hotel for a few weeks, and you dig in the wrong place, and you move 40, 50 tons of earth and rock, and there's nothing to show for it. That's a huge disaster. So archaeologists need to know where to dig and how to understand what they find. So they always look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, and the Jewish historian of the first century, Josephus. Always.
Above all, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead attests to the reliability of Jesus and the redemption he brings to those who believe. And yet, the first skeptics of the resurrection were the disciples themselves.
When the women report that the tomb is empty, the church leaders don't believe them. Okay, they think you're suffering from what I call a post-crucifixion syndrome. If you're inventing a story, would you invent a story that has your leaders be incredulous, absolutely incredulous about the most important thing in your faith? Unlikely.
Scholars note the irony that the first eyewitnesses of Christ risen from the dead were women.
A woman's testimony in that time was not highly regarded. In fact, Josephus, the Jewish historian, says that a woman's testimony was about as valuable as that of a thief and a robber. This is remarkable. If you are inventing a story about a resurrection, something that's already going to be very difficult for most people to believe, why are you going to make it doubly difficult by having your primary witnesses being women who are not really highly regarded?
For the disciples, a crucified Messiah is a failed Messiah. If the Messiah comes and is crucified, it shows you that he really wasn't the Messiah. That's the reason that the disciples run away. In their mind, they thought he was the Messiah, but he can't be if he dies on the cross. It's too shameful a death, and they had no idea about the resurrection. As many times as Jesus tells them, I'm going to be resurrected, the disciples are still shocked when the resurrection actually happens.
One of the most amazing things in the history of religious movements, I think, is the success of Christianity, because Jesus he teaches nonviolence, tells his disciples, turn the other cheek. He tells his disciples, pray for those who persecute you. He teaches his disciples, in a nutshell, don't exact vengeance against people who harm you, injure you, curse you. And Paul says that. We bless those who curse us. So this is a nonviolent movement. There is no evidence in the first 300 years of the existence of the Christian church of any kind of armed insurrection, any kind of army, any kind of attack against a city. Persecuted sometimes intensely, and yet spreads throughout the Roman Empire and captures the Roman Empire without any violence, without a shot fired.
If it were not for the resurrection, we would be just like those other 20 or 30 claimers to the Messiahship who eventually just failed and went away.
You see, if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity's true, period.